My husband Thomas is a writer of short horror, and I'm very proud of him. He crafts these unique little tales about horrific situations, and people really like them. I won't name drop here, but you may have read some of his work if you've been in the community for a while. He writes a lot, and his stories have been read by a lot of different narrators. Recently, though, things have changed. He's been thinking of narrating his own stories for years, but he just never thought he was up to the task. His voice won't play well with the audience, he says. No one will want to hear someone read their own stories, he says. His stories aren't very good, even though he makes money writing them. He has thousands of excuses, but finally I told him to just try it and keep his expectations realistic. He gave it a try, and from the first video, things have been great for him, but very strange for me. You see, when my husband records videos, he becomes someone else. It all started with Dr. Winston and the Hospital of Horrors, a series my husband writes. Dr. Winston is a stuttery little guy, someone who's afraid of his own shadow, and when my husband does his voice, it doesn't even sound like him anymore. I've never actually seen him do the voice. Not really. We have a 2-bedroom apartment, so he sets up his studio in the bedroom since our son has the other room. He bought one of those green screen curtains from Amazon and some wall foam to cut down on the reverb, and he pulls the curtain and sits behind the screen as he works. Sometimes I'll sit in bed and listen, hearing the story unfold, and the first time I heard that whispery little voice come from behind the curtain, I had to get up and peek and make sure it was just him back there. His voices are spectacular, and soon he had a dozen or more of them. Lenny Drover, Dr. Winston, Ozark Uncle, Raymond W. Sanders, Dr. Summer, just to name a few, but it's the Terrifier that I hate to hear. Tommy Terrifier is a reoccurring villain in his story. Tommy is a creature that hunts children after dark, and sometimes leaves them skinned alive beneath trees or on benches or somewhere else where people will find them. He's the antagonist of Corbin Banner, an Atlanta detective, and has become a fan favorite. The people just love the voice he does, the deep, resonating voice that speaks of horrible acts and terrible deeds. I sometimes put my headphones on when he reads stories about Skinner Park, but I find that the voice of Tommy the Terrifier still bleeds through my AirPods. "Don't worry, little one. I'll make it quick. You won't feel a thing. I'll snatch your skin so fast. You won't have time to..." Stop! Stop! Please, no! I shouted one evening, and my Thomas threw the curtain back and looked at me in alarm. "What's wrong? Are you okay?" he asked, the chair falling over as he stood up. Yeah, sorry. I must have dozed off and had a nightmare." He snorted and gave me a cuddle, going back to work as I turned up the volume and tried to ignore the horrible voice he used. We went to bed not long after. The audio finished for the evening, but when I woke up sometime later, I saw a light out of the corner of my eye. There was a ghostly glow from behind the curtain, and the edges billowed slightly in the breeze from the AC. He'd left his setup on, the curtain usually covering his workspace, and the chair was lit in the backdrop of the computer screen. I could swear there was something more behind that curtain, but I didn't have my glasses on, and I couldn't see it clearly. As I watched, the chair seemed to glide as it swiveled around. The curtain rustled ever so slightly at the bottom, and behind that gauzy barrier, I could see someone hunched in the chair. I couldn't see his face, but I could feel his eyes on me. They saw me seeing them, and when he smiled, it was like bugs on my skin. "Hello, Poppet. Fancy a stroll by the old canal?" I felt my breath hitch, my throat cramping as the terror spread through me. It was him. It was Tommy Terrifier. It was him, and he was just beyond the curtain. When he stood up suddenly, his height imposing despite his obvious age, my throat opened and the scream I loosed sounded like a tornado siren. My husband came awake violently, reaching for the bat he kept by the bedside. He believed that there was an intruder, that something had woken me up and scared the hell out of me. He was out of bed and looking for the source of my fear, and when I pointed to the curtain, he looked confused. He pushed the curtain aside with the bat and revealed nothing but the chair and the glowing screen of the monitor. I tried to explain to him what I had seen, but he just kissed my forehead and told me I must have been dreaming. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I found myself watching that curtain, waiting for the creature to return, praying it wouldn't get me if it did. As the sun came up, I finally slipped off, waking up a little later when the smell of lunch being cooked hit my nose. The bed was empty except for me, and Thomas had packed his green screen up after last night's scare. I could hear him in the kitchen whistling as he cooked something on the stove, and I crawled out of bed as I reached for my robe. It was Sunday, and our son was likely at someone's house, which would leave the two of us the day to ourselves. I would have plenty of chances to rest, the night before already a hazy memory, and as I crept up the hall, I tried to cover my mouth as I got ready to startle him. My husband, for writing such scary stuff, is kind of a fraidy cat. He puts on a spooky deep voice for his videos, but he's a big old scaredy cat in reality. My favorite thing to do is startle him, something I probably do too often, but as I came into the kitchen, he must have heard me. He never looked up from what he was cooking, but I heard a terrifyingly familiar voice just before I reached out to grab him. "Careful now, Puppet. You wouldn't want to startle me at my work." I don't know if I slipped when my foot came down, but when I hit the floor, I was already backpedaling. I was scooting away, my fear returning, and when he turned to look at me, I could swear his face had changed. Gone was the beard and glasses I'd grown accustomed to, the thin lips and the green eyes I loved. His face was pale and clean-shaven, his skin pockmarked and cratered. His teeth grinned shark-like from his mouth, thin and needle-like, and I screamed and covered my face as he took a step towards me. I flinched and struck out with my fists as he touched me, and when I saw that Thomas was looking down at me with concern, I felt confused. When I saw the trickle of blood coming from his nose, the confusion turned to shame. "Jesus, I'm so sorry. I didn't think you'd react that badly. I didn't mean to scare you. I heard you creeping up on me and thought I'd startle you a little for a change." He apologized as he helped me up, but that was only the beginning. I didn't sit in the bedroom while he recorded anymore, but that wasn't the last time I heard the voice of Tommy Terrifier. I heard it wafting from under the door, inserting itself in my ears as I tried to block it out on the couch in the living room. More terrifying still, I heard it in my husband's voice as he went about his day-to-day life. It was little things at first. Tommy Terrifier had a noticeable British accent, and I began to notice the way my husband pronounced certain words. He never noticed, but there was an inflection on certain words sometimes that made my skin crawl. When I mentioned it to him, he just looked at me strangely and said it must be something he wasn't aware of. Our son, Nathaniel, didn't seem to be able to hear it either, though. When I mentioned it to him, often right after it happened, he would shrug and say that he couldn't hear it. No one but me seemed to be able to hear the odd inflection he put on, and I began to feel like they were both messing with me. The other thing was that he started calling me Poppet. First I thought it was something he was doing on purpose, but when he kept looking at me strangely anytime I brought it up, I began to doubt. It was like he didn't realize he was saying it, and my upset confused him. We were having problems at this point, fighting over my perceived treatment, and his lack of understanding honestly made it worse. The straw that broke the camel's back, though, was the sleep talking. Thomas had never talked in his sleep. He barely even snored, but suddenly he was talking in his sleep almost every night. Well, it wasn't really him talking. It was Tommy Terrifier who was talking to someone as Thomas lay sleeping beside me. He always just called them Poppet, the name Tommy gave the kids in the stories before he killed them, but it was also the name he'd been calling me for weeks now. As I lay there listening to him talk about all the grisly things he meant to do, I realized that he might be talking to me instead of some random kid he was dreaming about. Sometimes he would turn his head and look in my direction, and I could feel his eyes behind his lids looking at me. I wanted to wake him up, but by now I realized it wouldn't do any good. He would just think I was having mental problems or something, and the fights would continue. I moved to the couch that night, and when he found me there in the morning, I told him I was having bad dreams and I didn't want to wake him up. Not long after that, he told me about a new angle for the show. The fans have really been liking the series, especially Tommy Terrifier, thinking about changing the show up so Tommy reads the stories sometimes. I might get more audience interaction, kind of shake up my listeners a little bit. I tried to be supportive of this, but I was not pleased to hear that Tommy would be making more appearances in his makeshift booth. After that, every third or fourth story was narrated by Tommy Terrifier. Then it was every other. As the voice became a regular part of his show, the night talking got worse. He would say the most depraved things I could barely believe my normally sweet husband would say. He would talk for hours about skinning people alive or pulling out their teeth, and I would lie there in terror as it all just played out around me. I'd taken to using sleep meds so I could get to sleep before him, but sometimes that voice would follow me into my dreams, and I would spend my nights in a state of constant terror. Sometimes I couldn't get to sleep before him, but even from the couch, his dark words seemed to find me. I came to realize that this wasn't something he could help, and I stopped bringing it up. He was so excited about his channel that I hated to put a damper on his enthusiasm by telling him how it affected me. Engagement was way up, he would say. He had more subscribers than ever, he would say. People were commenting how much they loved Tommy Terrifier, he would say. Ad revenue was at an all-time high, and maybe he could cut back at work and take more time for the channel, he would say. On and on and on about how people liked that terrifying voice of his, and I would nod and agree and tell him how great it all was. Meanwhile, I was a nervous wreck in my own home, waiting for the next encounter with Tommy. Before long, the show became Tommy Terrifier's Terrifying Tales, and Tommy began to make an appearance in every episode. That's when I began to notice the physical change in Thomas. He was spending more and more time in our bedroom, the door closed and that terrible voice creeping from beneath it. It wasn't just me hearing it now. Nathan had begun avoiding the back of the house, spending more time in the living room than usual when he was at home. I asked him why, but he wouldn't tell me. He said he hadn't been sleeping well lately, and I can relate. He's been sleeping on the couch with me sometimes, and we both shudder when the voice of Tommy Terrifier slips down the hall. That was a week ago. Now the only time he leaves the house is for evening runs. He says it's when he gets his best writing done, but I've come to doubt his words. He always comes back sweaty and disheveled, and his stories have taken a very dark cast. They've become less horror and more horrific. The mutilations and violence have reached a new level, and all of it is delivered by the voice of Tommy Terrifier. He doesn't even sound like himself when the mic is off now. His normal voice has begun to appear less and less, and I'm afraid that one day that pale creature will come out of the bedroom instead. It's getting late now, and though he hasn't come back, the police have come asking questions. They questioned everyone in the neighborhood at the start of the violence, but they had some very probing questions about my husband tonight. Where does he run? When does he run? Had I noticed any strange behavior? Did I notice a change in his personality? Apparently, some of the stories he's been writing lately have been a little too similar to the murders in the park, and the police want to bring him in as a person of interest. I told them he was out running and they could find him in the park. After they left, I put the chain on and waited for him to come back. He hasn't returned, but I woke up to hear a familiar voice coming from the bedroom. It seems there's a new story to be told tonight, and the sounds of Tommy Terrifier sound almost gleeful. I don't know what to do. I'm not even sure how he got back inside. I want to leave, but I'm frozen in fear as I sit on the couch with my son. I don't know if I'm more afraid that the voice will continue or that it will stop. Because if it stops, I'm not sure if I might not become just another one of those tales he reads for his audience every night. You're still here. I thought you might be. Thanks for joining me for tonight's story. If your insatiable appetite for horror knows no bounds, might I suggest one of our playlists, or one of our previous stories in the archive? There should be one appearing at the end of the story any minute now. And of course, if you're not subscribed, why not go ahead and hit that subscribe button? Maybe hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of the spooky things that we do here. If you prefer your horror a little more analog, you can always pick up one of my books. There's a link below to my latest, and it'll take you to all the great things that I've posted on Amazon. For my book lovers in the audience, I always suggest coming on down to Patreon so you can become part of my ghostly reader tier and get a book anytime I write one, which is usually about twice a year. Speaking of my patrons, let's go ahead and thank them, shall we? Thanks to Unicorn Hollow for being our spooky ghost contributor. Thanks to Janet and Lady Vengeance for being our spooky skeleton tier contributors. Thanks to Hi Stacy, Winter, Xaronan, Emily Coltsfoot, Stephanie Carrington, Marianne Schuler, Tyler Parker, and Jennifer Damron for being our ghostly reader tier contributors. Thanks, everyone. We just couldn't do the show without you. If you think you might like to support the show in a more monetary fashion, come on down to Patreon. I have many tiers. I'm sure you'll find one that suits you best. I always recommend the Ghostly Reader tier, since you get a signed book anytime I write one on your doorstep. But I have many tiers, and again, I'm sure you'll find one to suit you. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.